90% learn English better through listening than through grammar. Let me ask you a very simple question. And answer it with total honesty. How many years have you been studying English? And how many times have you felt that you are not making progress? Maybe you know grammar rules. Maybe you know what the present simple, the past simple, or the future tense are. Maybe you can even do written exercises. But when someone speaks to you in English, your mind goes blank. If this has happened to you, I want you to know something very important. It is not your fault. For decades, English has been taught in a way that does not match how the human brain actually learns. Today we are going to talk about something that can completely change the way you learn English. It is not a magic trick. It is not a false promise. And it is not a trend. It is a reality based on experience, observation, and science. Most people, around 90%, learn a language much better through listening than through excessive grammar study, especially in the early stages. And I want to be very clear from the beginning. This does not mean that grammar is not important. It means that it should not be the starting point. In this long, deep, and honest episode, you will understand why listening works better, why grammar has blocked you, and how you can start learning English in a more natural and human way. Our frustration with grammar. Think for a moment about how English is usually taught. Books full of rules. Endless tables. Exams. Memorization. From the very first day, they tell you. This is a verb. This is a grammatical tense. This is correct. This is wrong. And without realizing it, something dangerous happens. Your brain starts to associate English with stress, fear of making mistakes, confusion, frustration. Learning a language becomes a mental burden, not a natural experience. Many people start to think, I'm not good at languages. English is not for me. My brain is not made to learn this. But that is completely false. Your brain does know how to learn languages. It has done it before. The real question is, why did you learn Spanish effortlessly? And English feels so difficult? How did we learn our mother tongue? Now let's think about something fundamental. When you were a child, did someone sit you in front of a grammar book to learn Spanish? Did they explain what a verb was before you spoke? Of course not. You learned Spanish in only one way. By listening. You listened to your mother. You listened to your family. You listened to real conversations. You listened to stories. You listened to repetition. For months, even years, you did not speak, you only listened. Your brain absorbed sounds, rhythms, structures, and meanings, without consciously analyzing them. First you understood. Then you spoke. Never the other way around. This point is crucial. Human beings are designed to acquire languages, not to study them like mathematics. Listening was the foundation. Repetition was natural. Context did all the work. And most importantly, there was no fear of making mistakes. What makes the brain different? When you listen to a language consistently, something very powerful happens. Your brain begins to recognize patterns, associate sounds with meanings, anticipate words, understand without translating. This is called comprehensible input. You do not need to understand 100%. You only need to understand enough for the brain to do its job. Active listening creates deep neural connections. Much deeper than memorizing isolated rules. In addition, when you listen to stories, emotion is activated. Attention increases. Memory improves. Grammar, on the other hand, usually activates only the logical part of the brain. But it does not create fluency on its own. That is why many people know the rules, but do not know how to speak. An ethical and realistic message. Here I want to be very responsible with you. Grammar is important. But it has its moment. First. Listen. Understand. Become familiar. Lose the fear. Then. Organize. Refine. Improve accuracy. Grammar should be a tool, not a prison. If you start with listening, English stops being a school subject and becomes something alive. On this channel, and in this podcast, I am not going to promise miracles. I am going to offer you something better. A real, human, and sustainable path to learning English. And this is just the beginning. What does science say about learning languages? To understand why listening works so well, we need to talk a little about science. But don't worry. We are not going to use complicated technical words. We are going to explain it in a clear, human way, and in a way you can apply to your real life. The human brain does not learn languages the same way it learns historical dates or mathematical formulas. Language is not stored in just one part of the brain. It is distributed. When you listen to a language, auditory memory is activated. Emotional memory is activated. Intuition is activated. Prediction is activated. Your brain begins to anticipate what comes next, even without you realizing it. This is very important. Real language learning happens when you are not consciously analyzing every word, but when the brain starts to recognize patterns on its own. Science calls this acquisition, not study. To acquire a language means not translating, not thinking about rules, not stopping to analyze every sentence. Simply, understanding. And this is where listening becomes so powerful. Because listening, especially listening to stories, creates an environment very similar to the one your brain already knows from childhood. The concept of comprehensible input. There is a key concept in language acquisition called comprehensible input. You do not need to memorize that name. What matters is understanding the idea. Comprehensible input means that you listen to something in English. You do not understand everything. But you understand enough to follow the message. Maybe you understand 60%. Maybe 70%. That is perfect. Your brain does not need 100%. In fact, when you try to understand everything, you block yourself. When the input is comprehensible, the brain relaxes. Anxiety goes down. Learning becomes automatic. That is why children can listen to the same story 1,000 times and understand more each time. Not because they study more, but because they listen more. Repeated listening, in context, is what builds fluency. Not lists of rules. Why grammar alone does not create fluency. Now let's talk with total honesty. Grammar is not bad. The problem is how and when it is used. Most traditional methods make the same mistake. They start with grammar. This creates three very serious problems. First problem, mental overload. Your brain receives too much abstract information at the same time. Second problem, fear of making mistakes. You start thinking before speaking. And when you think too much, you don't speak. Third problem, emotional disconnection. Rules do not create emotion. And without emotion, there is no lasting memory. That is why many people can explain a rule, but cannot use it in a real conversation. They know what is correct, but they do not know how it sounds in real life. The psychological block that nobody talks about. There is something that almost no one talks about when teaching English. The psychological block. When a person learns English only through grammar, they are afraid to speak. They are afraid of sounding bad. They are afraid of making mistakes. And that fear paralyzes them. Listening, on the other hand, is safe. When you listen, no one judges you. You do not fail. There is no pressure. Your brain learns in silence. It is like training before going on stage. That is why listening is ideal for shy people, adults, people who have already failed with English. Listening rebuilds confidence. A real and human example. Think about this. There are people who never studied formal grammar. But they can understand movies, songs, and conversations. And there are people who studied grammar for years. But cannot understand a basic conversation. The difference is not intelligence. The difference is listening exposure. Listening creates familiarity. Familiarity creates understanding. Understanding creates fluency. And grammar, when it comes at the right moment, simply organizes something that already exists in your mind. It does not create it from zero. Final del formulario. The big mistake of traditional systems. Now we are going to talk about something uncomfortable. Something that almost no one dares to say clearly. Most educational systems are not designed for you to speak English. They are designed for you to pass exams. And that changes absolutely everything. From the very first day, the focus is usually memorizing rules, completing exercises, filling in the blanks, correcting mistakes constantly. But real language does not work like that. In a real conversation, you do not have time to think about rules. You do not have a teacher correcting you. There are no long pauses to analyze. Real English happens in real time. And here is the central problem. You were trained to analyze the language, not to use it. That is like learning to swim by reading a book, without ever getting into the water. Why does this approach affect adults more? Children have something that adults do not. Permission to make mistakes. A child says something wrong, and keeps talking. An adult says something wrong, and stays silent. When an adult learns English only through grammar, they become perfectionists. They mentally correct themselves. They constantly judge themselves. And that inner judgment kills fluency. Grammar demands precision. Communication demands confidence. Listening helps adults because it reduces pressure. It allows learning in silence. It builds familiarity before demanding production. That is why so many adults improve their English when they listen to podcasts, watch series, consume stories, even if they are not studying. The most damaging lie: I'm not good at languages. I want you to listen to this very carefully. There are no people who are bad at languages. There are incorrect methods, wrong moments, unrealistic expectations. When someone says, I'm not good at English, what they are really saying is, the method I used did not work for me. But the educational system rarely takes responsibility for that mistake. It is easier to blame the student. And that leaves scars. Intelligent, capable, disciplined people, convinced that they cannot learn English. Listening is powerful because it does not judge you. It does not compare you. It does not give you a grade. It simply exposes you to the language. And constant exposure changes beliefs. The role of emotion in learning. Here is something that almost no one mentions. The brain learns better when there is emotion. Stories activate curiosity, empathy, sustained attention. Grammar rules do not. When you listen to a story in English, you are not thinking, I am studying. You are thinking, I want to know what happens. And meanwhile, your brain is learning. This is not a coincidence. It is biology. Learning without emotion is fragile. Learning with emotion is long-lasting. That is why you remember English songs from years ago. Even if you do not remember a single grammar rule. Relearning how to learn. At this point, there is something very important you need to understand. Learning English is not about starting from zero. It is about retraining your brain. Giving it permission again to listen without pressure. Not understand everything. Learn little by little. Listening does not replace grammar. It prepares it. When you listen a lot, grammar starts to make sense. Rules stop being abstract. Everything fits together. First the ear. Then the conscious mind. That is the natural order. How to use listening correctly. Listening to English is not just playing audio in the background and waiting for miracles. Listening that works has intention, context, and continuity. First, let's talk about intention. Do not listen to understand every word. Listen to catch the general idea. When you try to understand everything, you get tense. You get frustrated. You block yourself. When you accept not understanding everything, you relax. You keep listening. Your brain starts connecting patterns. Second, context. Listening works better when there is a story, a situation, or an emotion. That is why stories work better than lists of phrases. Podcasts work better than isolated audios. Real-life stories work better than artificial examples. The human brain needs meaning, not just information. How much time should you listen each day? Here I want to be very honest with you. You do not need to listen to English 3 hours a day to make progress. You need consistency. For most people, these ranges work. Beginner, A1, A2 15 to 25 minutes daily. Intermediate, B1 25 to 40 minutes daily. Upper intermediate, B2 40 to 60 minutes daily. But there is something more important than time. Frequency. It is better 20 minutes every day than 2 hours once a week. The brain learns with frequent repetition, not with extreme effort. What type of content should you listen to? Not all English content is equally useful for learning. If you are starting, avoid fast news, movies without adaptation, podcasts for very advanced native speakers. That does not help you move forward. It frustrates you. The ideal content is podcasts with clear narration, stories spoken slowly, content with repeated vocabulary. Real English, but controlled. When the content matches your level, you do not need to translate. The brain learns naturally. Confidence increases. Listening to content that is too difficult does not make you better. It makes you quit. The most common mistake when using listening. Here is one of the most frequent mistakes. Many people listen to English, but they never repeat the listening. They listen once and move to the next audio. But the magic happens with repetition. Listening to the same content 2 times, 3 times, even 4 times. It is not boring. It is powerful. Each repetition clarifies words, reinforces structures, increases comprehension, reduces mental effort. Repetition does not mean stagnation. It means depth. When should you introduce grammar? Now yes, let's talk about the correct role of grammar. Grammar is useful when you already recognize phrases when you hear them. You already know how something correct sounds. You already have familiarity with the language. At that point, grammar organizes what you already know, clears doubts, improves accuracy. But it no longer blocks you. Grammar used after listening is light, logical, and understandable. Grammar used before listening is usually heavy and frustrating. Order matters. Building the habit. The real secret to learning English is not talent. It is habit. Do not wait for perfect motivation. Create a simple ritual. For example, listen to English when you wake up. Listen while you walk. Listen before going to sleep. Associate English with your daily life, not with a school obligation. When English becomes part of your routine, it stops being heavy. It stops being scary. It starts to flow. Motivational and ethical closing. I want you to keep this final idea. Learning English is not a race. It is a process. You do not need to be perfect. You need to be consistent. Listening is not a magic solution. It is a human and natural way to learn. Your brain already knows how to do this. It just needs the right environment. If for years they made you believe that you could not learn English, today you can start changing that story. One audio at a time. One story at a time. One day at a time. And if you are still here, listening, you are already on the right path.